The day my HOA fined me $5,000 for weeds was the same day a monarch butterfly landed on the violation notice. I remember that detail because 3 months later, that tiny orange and black insect would cost the HOA president her reputation. The paper crackled in my hand as I stood at the edge of my front field just after sunrise. The smell of wildflowers drifted through the cool morning air. Dew clung to knee-high stems, sparkling under the first light of a Tennessee summer morning. Hundreds of butterflies floated above the field like pieces of living stained glass. To me, it looked peaceful. To Linda Holloway, president of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, it looked like a problem. Her white Lexus SUV rolled slowly to a stop beside my driveway. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. Before I could even unfold the notice completely, she stepped out wearing a perfectly pressed polo shirt and sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. Her smile looked friendly from a distance. Up close, it felt like a warning. "You've got 30 days," she said, folding her arms. "This neighborhood has standards." I looked down at the bright red lettering across the page. Property violation. Fine, $5,000. Reason, excessive weeds and landscape neglect. A monarch butterfly drifted down and settled directly on the corner of the notice. Linda shook her head. "See? That's exactly what I'm talking about." I glanced across the field. Purple coneflowers swayed beside black-eyed Susans. Native milkweed stretched across the eastern corner near the fence line. The field wasn't abandoned. It was thriving. But Linda didn't see habitat. She saw grass that wasn't trimmed short enough to fit her vision of suburban perfection. "Those aren't weeds," I said calmly. "They're native plants." Her laugh was sharp enough to cut through the morning silence. "Native plants don't increase property values, Ethan." Then she turned and pointed toward the field like a general surveying enemy territory. "That mess is embarrassing the entire community." The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted over from neighboring yards. Every lawn on the street looked exactly the same. Perfectly trimmed. Perfectly watered. Perfectly lifeless. Mine was the only property buzzing with bees, butterflies, and birds. The only property that looked alive. Linda climbed back into her SUV and lowered the window before driving away. 30 days, she repeated. "Or the HOA will take further action." The engine faded into the distance. I stood there alone with the notice in my hand. The butterfly remained perched on the paper for several more seconds before lifting into the air and disappearing over the field. At the time, I thought this was just another HOA dispute. Another power-hungry president trying to control something she didn't understand. What I didn't know was that Linda Holloway had already started a chain of events that would bring state biologists, federal investigators, and environmental experts straight into our neighborhood. She thought she was declaring war on weeds. She had no idea she was about to challenge something the federal government had been protecting for years. The funny thing is that none of this land was supposed to belong to me. 20 years ago, most people would have driven right past it without a second glance. Back then it was just 5 acres of uneven ground on the edge of town, bordered by old oak trees and a shallow creek that dried out every August. The first person who ever saw value in it was my grandfather, Walter Walker. I can still remember the smell of motor oil and fresh soil every time he loaded me into his old Ford pickup and brought me out here on Saturday mornings. While other kids spent weekends at baseball games, I spent mine walking through fields, listening to stories about birds, butterflies, and native plants. Grandpa knew the name of every flower that grew naturally on this property. He could identify birds by sound alone. He treated the land like it was family. I was 10 years old the first time I asked him why he never mowed the eastern corner near the fence line. That section always looked different. Taller. Wilder. Full of milkweed, goldenrod, and clusters of flowers that attracted butterflies by the hundreds. He just smiled and adjusted his old work gloves. "Some things are more valuable when you leave them alone," he said. At the time, I thought he was talking about plants. Years later, I realized he was talking about people too. After college, I became an environmental engineer. I spent nearly 2 decades working on conservation projects across the Southeast. Wetland restoration, water quality studies, habitat preservation. The kind of work most people never notice until something disappears. Then 3 years ago, Grandpa passed away at 87. The house, the land, and everything attached to it became mine. The first time I unlocked the front door after the funeral, the silence felt heavier than any construction site I had ever worked on. His coffee mug still sat beside the sink. His boots still rested near the back porch. Even the faint smell of cedar and old books lingered in the air. Selling the property never crossed my mind. Instead, I moved in and started restoring it the way he would have wanted. Most of the neighbors thought I was crazy. Oak Ridge Estates was built around perfect appearances. Every lawn trimmed to exactly the same height. Every shrub shaped into identical green spheres. Every mailbox polished. Every flower bed designed by landscaping companies that charged more per month than some families spent on groceries. My property stood out immediately. Not because it was neglected. Because it looked alive. Spring brought bees. Summer brought butterflies. Songbirds nested along the tree line. Rabbits appeared near the creek at sunrise. The field changed colors with the seasons instead of staying the same artificial shade of green year-round. I loved it. Linda Holloway hated it. Looking back, I think the conflict started long before that violation notice appeared. Every HOA meeting included subtle comments about curb appeal. Every community newsletter contained reminders about landscaping standards. Every time Linda drove past my property, I caught her staring at the eastern field through the windshield. She never looked curious. She looked irritated. Like the existence of something she could not control personally offended her. The week before the notice arrived, I noticed her standing near the fence taking photographs with her phone. Butterflies drifted around her while she snapped picture after picture. At the time, I assumed she was collecting evidence for another complaint. What I did not realize was that she had already decided that field needed to disappear. And she was willing to push far harder than a simple warning letter to make that happen. The next HOA board meeting took place on a Thursday evening inside the community clubhouse, a brick building that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and furniture polish. By the time I arrived, nearly every folding chair was occupied. The soft hum of conversation filled the room. People nodded politely when they saw me, but most quickly looked away. Nobody wanted to get caught choosing sides. Linda sat at the front beneath the community logo with a stack of neatly organized folders in front of her. The moment she spotted me, her smile tightened. It was the same look she gave whenever something refused to fit into her version of how the neighborhood should work. I took a seat near the back and listened as the meeting moved through budget reports, landscaping updates, and maintenance schedules. Then Linda cleared her throat and adjusted her microphone. The room fell silent. "Next item," she announced. "Property compliance enforcement." I already knew what was coming. Several people shifted in their seats. A few turned toward me. Linda clicked a button on the projector remote. My property appeared on the screen behind her. The image had clearly been taken from the road. Wildflowers stretched across the field. Butterflies floated above the milkweed. The sunset in the photograph painted everything gold. To me, it looked beautiful. Linda treated it like evidence. "This," she said, pointing at the screen, "is a direct violation of community appearance standards." The room remained quiet. "The board has received multiple complaints." That caught my attention immediately because I knew it was not true. Most of my neighbors barely mentioned the field at all. Linda continued anyway. "Uncontrolled growth attracts pests, lowers property values, and creates visual inconsistency throughout the neighborhood." Visual inconsistency. The phrase sounded ridiculous even as she said it. One of the older homeowners near the front raised his hand. "Looks like flowers to me." A few people chuckled softly. Linda did not. Her expression hardened instantly. "Flowers belong in designated flower beds," she replied. "This is unmanaged vegetation." I could almost hear my grandfather laughing at that description. Linda clicked to another slide. More photographs. Close-ups of milkweed, goldenrod, native grasses. Every image labeled with red circles and arrows like she was presenting a criminal investigation. The projector fan whirred steadily overhead. The homeowner has 30 days to restore compliance, she announced. Failure to comply may result in additional penalties, liens, and corrective action authorized by the HOA. Several heads turned toward me again. I finally stood. The chair legs scraped lightly against the floor. Did anyone from the board actually inspect the property? I asked. Linda folded her arms. The photographs speak for themselves. That was not my question. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Did anyone inspect it? A brief silence followed. Linda glanced toward the other board members. None of them answered. The board has sufficient information, she said. So that is a no. Her jaw tightened. Mr. Walker, this is not a debate. The strange thing was that she sounded less confident than she had outside my driveway. For the first time, a few people in the audience seemed uncomfortable. They were beginning to notice something I had already realized. Linda was not enforcing standards anymore. She was making an example out of me. As the meeting ended, homeowners gathered in small groups near the exits. I overheard snippets of conversation. Some thought the fine was excessive. Others simply wanted the issue to disappear. Linda remained at the front collecting papers. Before leaving, she looked directly at me. You still have 27 days, she said. After that, the board will act. Then she smiled. Not the friendly kind. The kind that appears when someone believes they have already won. What Linda did not realize was that her campaign had just become public. She had shown the entire neighborhood those photographs. She had documented every inch of that field herself. And before long, those same pictures would become far more important than she could possibly imagine. Over the next week, the situation spread through Oak Ridge Estates faster than a summer storm. Every morning I woke up to the sound of notifications hitting my phone. The community social media page had become Linda Holloway's personal campaign headquarters. She posted photographs of my field almost daily. Some were the same pictures she had shown at the HOA meeting. Others were taken from different angles, always carefully framed to make the property look neglected instead of natural. The glow from my phone screen lit up the kitchen before sunrise as I scrolled through comment after comment. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room while butterflies drifted past the window outside. Inside the online discussions, people who had never stepped foot on my property suddenly became landscaping experts. One resident called the field an eyesore. Another described it as abandoned. Someone even suggested that the neighborhood should force immediate cleanup before property values suffered. Linda never directly insulted me. She was too smart for that. Instead, she encouraged the conversation. She replied with phrases like community standards and homeowner responsibility. Every comment nudged people toward the conclusion she wanted. The field was becoming a public target. The strange part was that many of the people criticizing it had originally complimented it. I remembered conversations from previous summers. Families stopping to watch butterflies. Children pointing at goldfinches near the fence line. Neighbors asking about the wildflowers. Now those same people were staying quiet or joining Linda's side. Fear of becoming the next HOA problem can change behavior surprisingly fast. 3 days later another envelope arrived. The paper felt heavier than the first notice. Additional fines. Additional warnings. Additional threats. The language had become more aggressive. Failure to comply could result in corrective measures authorized by the association. Corrective measures. Those words stayed with me. They sounded less like a policy and more like a promise. That evening I drove slowly through the neighborhood. Sprinklers hissed across identical front lawns. Freshly cut grass covered the air with that sharp green smell people associate with suburban perfection. Every house looked almost exactly the same. Every flower bed followed the same design. Every tree had been trimmed into neat shapes. The more I looked around, the more I realized what bothered Linda about my property. It was different. It refused to fit inside the template. A few days later I found out just how far she was willing to go. I was checking the mailbox when my neighbor, Tom Harrison, walked across the street. Tom had lived there nearly 15 years and rarely involved himself in HOA politics. His expression looked uneasy. He lowered his voice before speaking. "You should probably know something," he said. "Linda has been talking to landscaping companies." I felt my stomach tighten. "About what?" Tom glanced toward the road before answering. "About your field." The distant hum of a lawn mower echoed somewhere across the neighborhood. "She has been asking how much it would cost to clear everything." For a moment neither of us spoke. The summer breeze moved through the milkweed behind me. Butterflies floated above the flowers exactly as they always had. Meanwhile, someone was actively making plans to erase it all. Tom shook his head. "I thought you should know." After he left, I stood near the fence until sunset. The field glowed orange beneath the fading light. Birds settled into the trees. Crickets began their nightly chorus. Everything looked peaceful. But beneath that calm surface, the pressure was building. Linda had moved beyond complaints and public shaming. She was preparing to take action. What neither of us realized yet was that the very photographs she kept posting online were about to catch the attention of someone far outside Oak Ridge Estates. Someone who would look at those images and see something completely different from weeds. 2 mornings later I woke up to an unfamiliar sound drifting through the open bedroom window. Engines. More than one. The low mechanical rumble immediately felt wrong. Most mornings started with birdsong and the rustle of wind moving through the field. This sounded different. Urgent. Purposeful. I pulled on my boots and stepped outside. The smell of damp earth hung in the air from a light rain the night before. Dew still coated the flowers. For a brief second everything looked normal. Then I saw the trucks. 2 landscaping vehicles sat parked near the eastern edge of my property. Their yellow warning lights flashed against the morning haze. Several workers stood beside trailers loaded with commercial mowing equipment. My stomach dropped. The field stretched behind them, glowing green beneath the rising sun. Hundreds of butterflies floated above the milkweed exactly as they had every summer since I was a kid. One of the workers looked uncomfortable when he saw me approaching. Another checked a clipboard. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man holding the paperwork hesitated. "We were told the homeowner approved vegetation removal." I looked directly at him. "I am the homeowner." The expression on his face changed immediately. He flipped through the paperwork again. "The authorization came from the Homeowners Association." For several seconds nobody spoke. The distant chirping of birds filled the silence. Then another vehicle pulled into the driveway. White Lexus. Linda Holloway stepped out carrying a folder beneath one arm. She looked entirely too pleased with herself. "Good morning, Ethan," she said. "The board voted to begin corrective action." The words hit harder than I expected. "You do not own this property. The association has authority to maintain compliance. Not on private land." Her smile never moved. "You had ample opportunity to resolve the violation." The workers exchanged nervous glances. They clearly wanted no part of the argument. One of them quietly stepped back toward his truck. I could not blame him. Even they seemed to realize something felt wrong. Linda opened her folder and removed several documents. The pages fluttered lightly in the breeze. "The costs will be billed to your account," she explained. "Failure to pay may result in additional enforcement." I looked past her toward the field. A monarch butterfly drifted across the property line and landed on a cluster of milkweed blooms. Another settled nearby. Then another. Orange wings moved through the morning sunlight like floating pieces of stained glass. The sight reminded me of something my grandfather used to say. "Healthy land speaks for itself if people are willing to listen." Linda never listened. She only measured, controlled, and demanded. "You are making a mistake," I told her. "Then why are you the only person defending this?" she asked. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I almost ignored it. Almost. The caller identification showed a number from the state university. I stepped aside and answered. The voice on the other end sounded excited. Mr. Walker? My name is Dr. Nathan Reynolds. I hope this is not a bad time. I glanced at the trucks. The workers. Linda. Actually, I said slowly, it might be the perfect time. The professor explained that he had seen photographs circulating online. Specifically photographs showing large concentrations of milkweed and monarch butterflies. His department had been monitoring habitat decline throughout the region. The images caught his attention immediately. As he spoke, I watched Linda continue organizing paperwork beside her car, completely unaware of the conversation taking place. Mr. Walker, Dr. Reynolds said, there is a possibility your property contains something extremely important. I would like to visit as soon as possible. For the first time in weeks, I felt the balance begin to shift. Linda believed she was minutes away from winning. She had no idea someone nearly 200 miles away had just looked at the same photographs she used to shame me and seen something worth protecting. Dr. Nathan Reynolds arrived 3 days later in a dusty university pickup truck carrying a camera bag, a notebook, and the kind of excitement most people reserve for winning the lottery. The morning air smelled of wildflowers and freshly watered soil as he stepped out and stared across the eastern field. For nearly a full minute he said nothing. He simply watched. Monarch butterflies drifted above the milkweed. Bees moved from flower to flower. A pair of goldfinches darted through the tall stems near the fence line. Finally he shook his head and let out a quiet laugh. I cannot believe these photographs were posted online as evidence of a violation, he said. We spent the next several hours walking the property. The sun climbed higher overhead while he documented everything. He photographed plants, counted butterfly activity, marked locations on a digital map. Every few minutes he would stop and point something out. Native species, pollinator corridors, seasonal bloom patterns. Details most people would never notice. The deeper we moved into the eastern section, the more excited he became. Around noon we reached the exact corner my grandfather had always protected. The same place he refused to mow. The same place he always told me to leave alone. Dr. Reynolds knelt beside a patch of milkweed and carefully examined several leaves. Then he looked up at me with an expression I had not seen before. Ethan, how long has this area been left mostly undisturbed? I thought about it. At least 30 years. Probably longer. He slowly stood. That explains a lot. The breeze carried the scent of warm grass across the field while butterflies floated around us. Explains what? I asked. He glanced across the landscape. Most habitats like this disappeared years ago. Development removed many of them. Intensive landscaping removed even more. Places that remain intact for decades are becoming increasingly rare. My grandfather's words echoed through my memory. Some things are more valuable when you leave them alone. For the first time, I began to wonder if he had known more than he ever told me. Before leaving, Dr. Reynolds asked permission to share his findings with several colleagues involved in regional conservation studies. I agreed immediately. As his truck disappeared down the road, I felt something changing. The conversation was no longer about landscaping preferences. It was becoming something much bigger. The following week proved it. Emails started arriving from researchers. Then biologists. Then conservation groups. Several requested photographs. Others requested site information. One even asked whether historical records existed for the property. Meanwhile, Linda seemed completely unaware of what was happening. Her campaign continued across the community page. More photographs. More complaints. More demands that the field be cleared. Every new post generated fresh comments from residents. But now I viewed them differently. Each photograph she shared revealed more details researchers wanted to examine. Every attempt to embarrass me was creating a larger public record. Then one afternoon an email arrived that stopped me cold. The subject line contained only 6 words. Historical habitat records located. My heart started racing before I even opened it. Attached were scanned documents from decades earlier. Survey notes. Ecological observations. Species counts. And at the bottom of one faded report was a familiar signature. Walter Walker. My grandfather. I stared at the screen while the late afternoon sunlight poured through the kitchen window. Outside, butterflies drifted through the field exactly as they always had. Inside, a secret buried for years was beginning to surface. Suddenly his warnings made sense. The protected corner. The refusal to mow. The insistence that the land remain untouched. He had not been preserving it out of sentiment. He had been preserving it for a reason. And somewhere in those old records was the answer Linda would soon wish she had never forced anyone to find. The documents changed everything. For 2 nights I sat at my grandfather's old kitchen table surrounded by scanned reports, handwritten notes, survey maps, and correspondence dating back decades. The faint smell of old paper mixed with fresh coffee while a desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across the pages. Outside, the field remained quiet beneath the stars. Inside, a much larger story was beginning to emerge. Walter Walker had not simply owned the property. He had participated in regional conservation surveys during the 1980s and 90s. Several reports referenced seasonal monarch activity, native milkweed density, and migration support zones. One notation appeared again and again beside the eastern section of the property. High ecological significance. I read those words 3 times. Then 4. Every time I looked at them, I imagined Linda standing in front of the HOA meeting calling it unmanaged vegetation. The contrast was almost unbelievable. By the end of the week, Dr. Reynolds returned with 2 additional specialists. Their vehicles rolled slowly into the driveway early Saturday morning while fog still hovered above the field. The sound of birds echoed from the tree line. Butterflies drifted through the cool air as the team began their survey. They measured plant distribution, recorded species activity, and compared current conditions against historical records. What started as a simple visit turned into an all-day assessment. Their excitement grew with every hour. Around midday, one of the biologists lowered her binoculars and shook her head in disbelief. "You do not see intact habitat like this very often anymore," she said. "Especially inside a residential development." Meanwhile, Linda was becoming increasingly aggressive. New notices appeared in my mailbox. New deadlines. New warnings. She seemed determined to force action before anyone outside the neighborhood paid serious attention. Several residents later told me she had started speaking privately with homeowners about organizing support for immediate removal. The strange thing was that her urgency no longer made sense. Most HOA disputes drag on for months. Linda suddenly wanted everything resolved immediately. It felt less like enforcement, and more like panic. Then came the email that confirmed my suspicion. A regional conservation organization reviewed the survey data and requested a formal site evaluation. Not eventually. Not sometime next year. Immediately. Their message included language that caught my attention. Potential habitat significance requiring further review. I stared at the screen while my heart pounded. This was moving far faster than anyone expected. News traveled quickly among the researchers involved. Additional experts requested access. Additional records surfaced. Every new discovery strengthened the same conclusion. The field was not ordinary. The following Tuesday afternoon I noticed Linda's Lexus parked near the entrance to the property. She was speaking with 2 board members while repeatedly pointing toward the eastern corner. Even from a distance I could tell she was frustrated. Her movements were sharp. Impatient. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes before they finally drove away. Later that evening another message appeared on the community page. Linda announced that the HOA would soon move forward with comprehensive corrective measures if compliance was not achieved. The comments exploded almost immediately. Some residents supported her. Others questioned why the issue had escalated so dramatically. For the first time, public opinion was beginning to crack. People were asking questions. Questions Linda clearly did not want answered. 3 days later, I received a phone call from Dr. Reynolds just before sunset. The sky glowed orange above the field while monarch butterflies floated through the last light of the day. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Ethan," he said, "I need you to know something. Several agencies have reviewed the preliminary findings." I gripped the phone tighter. "And?" A brief pause followed. Then he said the words that changed everything. "No one should alter that habitat until the review process is complete." As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, I looked across the field my grandfather had protected for decades. For the first time, it felt like we were no longer defending the land alone. The problem was that Linda had already set events in motion. And from everything I was seeing, she had absolutely no intention of stopping. The showdown arrived on a humid Thursday morning just after sunrise. I knew something was wrong the moment I heard engines approaching from the road. The sound rolled across the neighborhood long before the vehicles came into view. I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee in my hand and watched as 2 landscaping trucks turned into the subdivision entrance. Behind them came a pickup carrying equipment trailers. My stomach tightened immediately. The smell of wildflowers drifted through the air while monarch butterflies floated above the eastern field. Everything looked calm except for the convoy heading straight toward my property. By the time I reached the driveway, several neighbors had already gathered outside. Curtains moved. Garage doors opened. People sensed something important was about to happen. The trucks slowed near the field and stopped. Workers climbed out carrying clipboards and equipment. A few moments later, Linda Holloway arrived in her white Lexus. She stepped out smiling with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. "Good morning, Ethan," she called. "Today we finally solved this problem." The workers began discussing boundaries and access points. Linda opened a folder and started reviewing documents. I looked across the field. Butterflies drifted through the milkweed. Bees moved from flower to flower. The entire scene felt strangely peaceful considering what was happening. Then another sound reached us. Different engines. Larger vehicles. Heads turned toward the road. Linda stopped speaking. One by one, several government vehicles entered the neighborhood. White trucks. Official markings. Agency logos. The convoy rolled slowly toward us before parking along the roadside. The entire street seemed to fall silent. Doors opened. Men and women carrying field equipment, cameras, and document cases stepped out. Several wore identification badges clipped to their shirts. I recognized Dr. Reynolds immediately. He was walking beside 2 officials I had never met before. Linda's expression changed instantly. Confusion replaced confidence. One of the agency representatives approached and introduced herself. Then she calmly explained that multiple organizations had completed an initial review of the property and historical records. She referenced decades of ecological documentation, habitat surveys, conservation data, migration support research. Every sentence seemed to make Linda more uncomfortable. Neighbors gathered closer as the discussion continued. The official opened a folder and removed several documents. Among them were copies of the old records bearing my grandfather's signature. Walter Walker. The same reports that had been sitting forgotten in archives for years. Suddenly the pieces fit together. My grandfather had not simply cared about the field. He had helped establish the data that placed it on the radar of conservation researchers decades earlier. The protected corner he always refused to disturb was the exact area receiving the most attention now. The official continued explaining that further review would proceed and that no alteration of the habitat should occur while the process remained active. The landscaping crews quietly stepped back. Several workers returned equipment to their trucks. Nobody seemed interested in touching a single plant anymore. Linda tried asking questions. Then more questions. Each answer seemed to make the situation worse for her. Around us, neighbors listened carefully. Many of them had spent months hearing her describe the field as a nuisance. Now they were hearing experts describe it very differently. I glanced across the property as butterflies drifted through the sunlight. The same photographs Linda had used to build her case had helped attract the attention of scientists and agencies. The same field she wanted erased had become the center of a growing review process. And standing there watching government officials examine documents connected to my grandfather's work, I realized the balance of power had shifted completely. Linda thought she had arrived to supervise a cleanup. Instead, she had just witnessed the beginning of an investigation she never saw coming. The final chapter unfolded over the next 2 months, and it happened far more publicly than Linda Holloway ever would have wanted. What began as a neighborhood dispute slowly transformed into the biggest topic anyone in Oak Ridge Estates had discussed in years. Agency reviews continued. Researchers returned multiple times. Historical records were examined in greater detail. Every week seemed to bring another discovery connected to the field and the decades of conservation work surrounding it. The smell of late summer wildflowers still drifted across the property every morning, but now visitors arrived regularly carrying cameras, notebooks, and survey equipment instead of complaints. One afternoon I received official notice that all HOA fines associated with the property had been suspended pending the outcome of the review. A week later they were formally withdrawn altogether. The same board that had spent months issuing violations suddenly wanted distance from the entire situation. During the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere felt completely different from the one I remembered. The clubhouse still smelled like coffee and furniture polish, but the confidence Linda once carried had vanished. Residents filled nearly every chair. Questions came from every direction. Why had the board pushed so aggressively? Why had experts never been consulted? Why had public accusations been posted before any investigation took place? For the first time, Linda did not control the room. She sat quietly while homeowners demanded answers. The photographs she had shared online appeared again during discussions. Only now people viewed them differently. Instead of evidence of neglect, they had become evidence of what existed before anyone understood its significance. Several weeks later, the review process reached its conclusion. Representatives from multiple organizations gathered at the property on a clear autumn morning. The sky stretched bright blue above the field. Monarch butterflies still moved through the milkweed despite the changing season. Standing there among the flowers, I listened as officials explained their findings. The habitat possessed documented ecological value supported by decades of records. Historical survey data connected directly to ongoing conservation efforts. And at the center of those records stood my grandfather, Walter Walker, whose observations had helped preserve information that might otherwise have disappeared. Hearing his name spoken aloud by people who had never met him felt strangely emotional. For years I thought he had simply loved the land. Now I understood that he had quietly protected something important long before anyone else noticed. The most satisfying moment came a few days later. A permanent educational marker was installed near the edge of the property. Neighbors gathered to watch. Children pointed at butterflies. Residents who once criticized the field now asked questions about native plants and pollinator habitats. The conversation had completely changed. The marker recognized the ecological significance of the area and the historical contributions connected to its preservation. As workers secured the sign into place, I noticed a familiar flash of orange and black drifting through the sunlight. A monarch butterfly settled briefly on the edge of the marker before lifting back into the air. Instantly I remembered the butterfly that had landed on the violation notice months earlier. The same symbol that Linda dismissed had remained there from beginning to end. In the weeks that followed, new board elections were held. Community priorities shifted. Conversations became less about controlling appearances and more about understanding the neighborhood itself. The field remained exactly where it had always been. The flowers returned. The butterflies returned. The birds returned. Nothing about the land needed to change because there had never been anything wrong with it in the first place. Sometimes I still walk through the eastern corner at sunrise. The air smells the same as it did when my grandfather brought me there as a child. The milkweed still sways in the breeze. The butterflies still drift across the field. And every time I pass that marker, I think about how close it all came to being erased by someone who never bothered to understand what she was looking at. Linda spent months calling it a problem. Experts called it a habitat. History called it worth protecting. And in the end, history won.